Before turning to the final formulation of the complex issue of resistance to evil by force, it is necessary to make a few more endeavors, clearing the way. So, first of all, it is necessary to find out what coercion is and what violence is. Are they the same thing, or is there a fundamental difference between the two? And if there is, then what is it? In order to resolve this essential question so thoroughly confused by sentimental moralists, and also suffering from a lack of appropriate words in the language, we must first turn to the general generic terms, which can be conditionally designated as forms of delivery, strictly speaking, imposing the application of inducement on a human being. It is necessary to call such a delivery the imposing of a will on the internal or external structure of the person, which does not appeal to the spiritual vision and submission to love of the targeted soul directly, but tries to compel it or stop to its activity. It is clear that if a preliminary appeal to the spiritual vision, whether in words of persuasion or in the form of a turning of the other cheek, is accomplished and brings about in the soul a state of clarity, then a free conviction will arise, and then the acting effect of this willpower will be organically free, not induced. And in the same way, if a preliminary appeal to a submission to love causes a state of love in the soul, then consent and unity will arise. And then, again, the acting effect of the willpower will be organically free, not induced. Such an imposition of will on human life can be carried out within the confines of an individual being. A person can induce himself, but it can also occur within the communication of two or many people. People can induce each other. Every inducement is either self-inducement or the inducement of others. Further, this inducement can be expressed in terms of its impact on motives of behavior. For example, authoritative order, prohibition, threat, boycott, but can also be expressed in direct impact on the human body. Examples: push, kick, bind, confine, kill. According to this, it is necessary to distinguish between a mental inducement and a physical inducement, and both self-inducement and the inducement of others can have both a mental and a physical character. Thus, a man who is mentally tired or half asleep, or overcoming a recalcitrant attitude and imagination, or engaging in unloved mental work, or assimilating something mechanically, for example, memorizing by heart, solving arithmetical problems, some internal exercises of memory and attention, and so on, etc., can also extract himself and the center of his well-being from involuntary entailments. The overwhelming element of laziness, sleep, or pleasure, to move this center into the appropriately intensified energy of the spirit and subject his mental faculties to a defining inducement. A person can internally induce himself, pressuring himself in the effort and even subordinating himself to compulsion. Such a state of mental inducement can be described by the term self-compulsion. Similarly, physical self-inducement is possible, which is usually associated with the mental. Such, for example, are all kinds of physical labor performed without a direct infatuation for, or at least an attraction to, the work, as well as that carried out by the weary. Many types of bodily medical treatment may come under this heading in cases of an agonizing operation, for example. And such are all the ascetic exercises associated with bodily suffering which are not accompanied by ecstasy. In these cases, the person is strengthened mentally in order to forcefully evoke certain bodily states, active order, examples, muscular effort, or passive order, example, standing on a pillar. A person can in fact not just mentally urge himself but also coerce himself into a bodily achievement and refuse to perform certain common actions. Such a state can be designated by the term self-coercion. Inducing others is also possible in the mental and physical order. With a properly deep and broad understanding, every order and prohibition that does not directly appeal to clarity and love, but refers to the volitional energy of the spirit, any reinforcing order of mental isolation, example, the breaking off of relations, exclusion from a club, and any threat, in whatever ways unintentional, are forms of mental compulsion. The essence of this compulsion is the psychic pressure on the will of man, and this pressure should induce his own will to a certain decision and, perhaps, self-inducement. Strictly speaking, this pressure can only complicate or modify the motivational process in the soul of the compelled, informing him of new motives that have not been accepted by him yet in the order of conviction and devotion, or strengthening and weakening the already existing ones. It is clear that this influence can meet in the soul such an energy of resistance, such a spiritually strong will or a spiritual obsession with passions, that all its power will not be sufficient, because the mental inducement strives, without constraining the external freedom of the induced one, to induce him to decide to do something or not to do something. Such an influence induces and compels a person. coming to him from without, but refers to his soul and spirit, so we can agree to call it a mental compulsion. Finally, the possibility of physically influencing others for the purpose of compulsion does not seem to raise doubts. However, it is noteworthy that any such impact on someone else's body has inevitable psychological consequences for he who is being induced. From an unpleasant sensation with a jerk to a feeling of pain when tortured, and ending with the inability to do anything at the point of imprisonment, and the inability to desire anything with the death penalty. The vast majority of these acts, with the exception of pathological cases of random, fierce violence, are carried out precisely for the sake of such mental reflections or consequences. This explains why physically compelled people usually try to get rid of those who induce them by giving assurances that they agree, that willful unity has come and that subordination henceforth is ensured. It is clear that arresting, tying, torturing, and imprisoning another, a person cannot directly produce in him the desired psychospiritual changes. He cannot dispose of another from within, to replace another's will with his own, to evoke in him consent based on conviction, and behavior based on voluntary devotion. A person is not allowed to coerce others into genuine deeds, that is, to mentally and spiritually whole acts. Physical influence on another cannot always even force a person to do something he finds unacceptable, Mucius Scaevola, the Christian Martyrs. But the spiritual significance of such a forced external act, example, insincere confession, forced signature, etc., depends on the further free recognition of this by the one who succumbed to torture, as in the case of some witch trials, or the story of Galileo. A person physically compelled by another always has two outcomes that relieve him of this external pressure: hypocrisy and death, and only one who is afraid of death or inwardly cannot stand the hypocrisy of a split personality speaks of coercion as a possible and real event. But he should also remember that his coercion by itself will fade away at the time of his personal, spiritual, and purely internal uprising, and the assertion of his true conviction and sincere devotions. This is why it is more cautious and more precise not to talk about physical coercion, but about physical compulsion. It is clear, finally, that a physical admonition can be directed at someone else's inaction or action. In the first case, it is extremely limited in its capabilities. Powerless to call forth a holistic act, always forced to expect a defense of hypocrisy from the compelled one, it can rely only on the slow influence of the external regime and its penetration into the human soul. But in the second case, physical influence can more easily rely on feasibility and success. It can stop known activities, prevent a certain person from doing something, of course, not everyone and not in everything, or make him cease doing it, hence the possibility, along with physical compulsion, of physical suppression. These are the main types of general inducement: self-compulsion, self-coercion, mental compulsion, physical compulsion, and physical suppression. And it would be a profound spiritual mistake to equate such inducement with violence and give central importance to this last term. The very word violence already hides a negative assessment. Violence is an arbitrary act, unreasonable, outrageous. A violent one is a person transgressing the limits of the permissible, attacking, victimizing, the oppressor and the villain. Against violence we should protest. It must be fought. In any case, a person who has been subjected to violence is offended, oppressed, and deserving of sympathy and help. One application of this value-infused and effectively colored term causes negative tension in the soul and prejudices the question under investigation in the negative sense. To prove the permissibility or legitimacy of violence means to prove the permissibility of the impermissible or the legitimacy of the illegitimate. Whether effectively, spiritually, and logically proven or not, to make such claims immediately turns out to be emotionally unacceptable and vitally contentious. The wrong term splits the soul and obscures its clarity. That is why it will be advisable to reserve the term violence for referring to all cases of reprehensible inducement coming from an evil soul or a spiteful direction, and to establish other terms to denote a non-objectionable inducement originating from a benevolent soul or compelling towards good. Then, for example, the concept of self-inducement will be subject, on the one hand, to the concepts of self-compulsion and self-coercion, and on the other hand, the corresponding types of mental and physical self-abuse, and further, on the one hand, the notion of external inducement will be subject to the concepts of mental compulsion, physical compulsion, and suppression, and on the other, the corresponding types of mental and physical violence against others. And only then, through clarified terminology, for the first time it will be revealed the very problem of unreasonable inducement and its varieties. It is remarkable that Leo Tolstoy and his school completely fail to notice the complexity of this whole phenomenon. They know only one term, and moreover the one which prejudges the whole question with its effective coloring. They speak and write only about violence and, choosing this unfortunate, disgusting term, provide themselves with a biased and blinded attitude to the whole problem. This is natural. There is no need even to be a sentimental moralist in order to answer negatively the question of the admissibility or laudability of embittered ugliness and oppression. However, the uniqueness of this chosen term conceals behind it a much deeper error. Leo Tolstoy and his school see no complexity in the subject matter. They not only label all inducement as violence, but also reject all external compulsion and suppression as violence. Generally speaking, the terms violence and evil are used by them synonymously to such an extent that the very problem of non-resistance to evil by violence is sometimes formulated as a problem of non-resistance to evil with evil, or returning evil for evil. This is why violence is sometimes equated with Satan, and its use is described as the way of the devil. It is clear that the appeal to this satanic evil is forbidden once and for all and without exceptions, so it is better to die or to be killed than to use violence. Moreover, one of these moralists tries even to establish that those who are victorious by force are always and invariably wrong, for truth and God are always with the vanquished. Fairness demands we recognize that all these condemnations do not concern themselves with internal self-inducement, which is simply described as the violence of the spirit over the flesh, and is allowed in the order of moral action. However, outside of my body, the permissibility of inducement is also limited. Another's flesh has its master, and therefore violence directed at the other is not necessary. Because it is impossible to prove that the other is incapable of true self-management from within, and to deny freedom and humanity is unacceptable. Therefore, any going beyond the bounds of one's own being is recognized as unjustified advantage, not a result of necessity, but an invasion of God's domain, a sacrilegious replacement of the will of God as allegedly insufficient, and one which reveals in the soul of the assailant the direct denial of God. We must give others ourselves and completely cease the external struggle against evil as unnatural and unfruitful. It is necessary to stop arranging the life of other people and to understand that no matter who commits violence and to what end it is done, it will still be evil without any exceptions. And all those who do not wish to understand this and continue to assail are bandits on large roads, revolutionaries, hangmen, spies, senators, ministers, monarchs, party leaders, and all general politicians. Those who go astray and are bribed as often as not, indulging in their habitual vices, vengeance, cupidity, envy, ambition, pride, cowardice, and spite. Thus, in the whole sphere of conscious inducement, Tolstoy and his adherents see only self-coercion, violence over one's body, and physical violence against others. The first they approve, the second they certainly reject. However, they clearly refer to the physical compulsion of others and suppression in the sphere of repudiated violence and, apparently without acknowledging the possibility of mental compulsion and mental violence towards others, reject everything at once as an unnecessary, evil, and godless interference in the lives of others.